Imagine a human figure vanishing right in front of the camera, not hiding behind anything, not running out of frame. One moment it's there, and then it isn't. The camera didn't blink, the operator didn't move the equipment, nobody performed a sleight of hand. What happened was far simpler and far more powerful. Someone stopped the filming for just a moment, removed the actor from the shot, and started filming again with the same empty space. When the footage was projected, the figure simply ceased to exist on screen. That was one of the first moments when cinema understood that it could do more than record the world. It could erase it, transform it, and rebuild it however it chose. Film was born as a tool of observation. Its creators imagined it as a machine for capturing movement exactly as it happened. A train pulling into a station, workers leaving a factory, waves breaking on a shore. The value was in faithfulness to the moment, in the ability to preserve something that would otherwise be lost forever. But that logic of pure recording ran out of road very quickly. Because as soon as the camera was in the hands of people with theatrical imagination, the question shifted. It was no longer what can this machine capture, but what can it invent? Georges Méliès came to cinema from a completely different world. He was a magician, a theater man, a stage illusionist. He ran a spectacle company in Paris and understood better than almost anyone the power of illusion over an audience that knows it is being deceived but chooses to believe anyway. When he saw the first Lumière projections in the late 19th century, he did not see a scientific instrument. He saw a new tool for doing exactly what he already did: astonishing people, unsettling them, making things appear and disappear in front of a crowd. He bought a camera, built a studio on the outskirts of Paris with glass walls to make use of natural light, and started experimenting. The discovery that gets talked about most often was almost an accident. Méliès was filming a scene on the street when the camera jammed. When it started rolling again, the setting looked the same, but some of the elements in the frame had shifted or disappeared. Watching the projected result, he understood exactly what had happened. The involuntary interruption had created a substitution. Something was there, and then it was not. That accidental cut became a deliberate technique known as the substitution splice, or stop trick. All you had to do was stop the camera, alter the set, or remove someone from the shot, and start filming again. The cut was invisible in projection, and the resulting effect was an instantaneous transformation that no stage trick could match. From there, Méliès explored with the methodical focus of an inventor and the instincts of an artist. He discovered double exposure, which meant filming the same scene twice on the same strip of film and layering the two images on top of each other. With that technique, you could make a figure appear translucent, make a ghost walk through a wall, make a giant face float over a miniature landscape. Superimposition made it possible to combine elements that had never physically shared the same space at the same time. The cinematic image was no longer simply the sum of what stood in front of the camera. It had become a construction. In 1902, Méliès took all of this to a scale no one had attempted before. A Trip to the Moon was a film of about 14 minutes that brought together substitution tricks, double exposures, elaborate sets, theatrical costumes, actors dressed as lunar creatures, and a conception of space that had nothing to do with the real world. The travelers arrived on the moon in a rocket fired from a cannon, and the moon itself had a human face. The projectile landed directly in its eye in one of the most reproduced images in early film history. Nothing that appeared on screen had actually existed in front of the camera the way it looked. It was a total fabrication, built frame by frame out of theatrical resources, optical tricks, and an absolute confidence in the audience's willingness to go along for the ride. That audience, for its part, was not being cheated. They knew what they were watching was an illusion. The agreement of the darkened theater had always been different from that of documentary photography. The viewer was willing to enter a constructed world as long as that world was convincing enough or exciting enough to hold their disbelief in suspension. Méliès understood this before nearly all of his contemporaries, and he built an entire career on that understanding. But camera tricks had their limits. They could make people disappear, layer images together, create impossible transitions. What they could not do was build a physical world larger than the available set, represent catastrophe at full scale, show landscapes that did not exist, or destroy cities without consequences. For that, cinema developed a different set of solutions. One of the most enduring was the miniature. A miniature is a scaled-down version of something that would be impossible or prohibitively expensive to build at full size. A sinking ship, a collapsing building, a city in flames, an erupting volcano. If the miniature was well constructed and the camera filmed it from the right angle, with the right lighting and the projection speed adjusted to account for the scale, the result could be indistinguishable from reality to an untrained eye. The teams that built these models were specialized craftspeople, sculptors, and carpenters who worked with extraordinary precision so that every detail would suggest real size and weight. Alongside miniatures came another technique that expanded cinematic worlds in a different way: the matte painting. The concept was simple, even if the execution was not. An artist would paint part of the environment that did not physically exist onto a glass panel. That panel was then positioned between the camera and the real set, so the painting filled in the areas of the frame where nothing had been built. A castle might have its lower towers constructed as a physical set, where actors moved, but its upper towers were paint on glass. A city might have real streets at ground level, and its skyline, horizon, and distant buildings painted in. The camera recorded both layers simultaneously, producing a single image that combined the real and the painted with no visible seam. Matte painters were technical artists who needed to master both visual representation and a deep understanding of how the camera, light, and distance transformed whatever was placed in front of the lens. But there was something that miniatures and paintings could not do: move. They could show an impossible world, but that world was static. To bring to life creatures that did not exist, to make monsters, dinosaurs, skeletons, or fantastical figures move through a scene with genuine weight and personality. Cinema developed stop motion. The technique required patience, pushed to its outer limits. A figure was built with an articulated internal skeleton, usually made of metal, that allowed it to be repositioned with precision. A surface layer simulating skin, scales, fur, or whatever texture was needed was applied over that armature. The figure was placed in front of a set, and a single frame was shot. Then it was moved a fraction of an inch. Every joint was carefully adjusted, and another frame was shot. That process was repeated for every instant of movement. When the film was projected at normal speed, the creature appeared to move on its own, with a fluidity that depended entirely on the accumulated precision of hundreds or thousands of tiny, manual adjustments. Willis O'Brien was the animator who brought that technique to its first great demonstration of power. King Kong, released in 1933, introduced a giant gorilla that was not just a special effect. It was a character. It had weight. It had expressiveness. It had an emotional presence that audiences felt as real, even though intellectually they knew they were looking at an articulated figure about 20 inches tall being shot one frame at a time. The scene of Kong atop the Empire State Building fending off biplanes while clutching the film's heroine, combined miniatures, rear projection of live footage, stop-motion animation, and the compositing of multiple separate layers into a single image. In technical terms, it was an accumulation of stacked illusions. In cinematic terms, it was a scene that audiences remembered as if it had actually happened. Rear projection was another tool in that arsenal. It involved projecting a pre-recorded image onto a translucent screen behind the actors, who could then physically interact with an environment that had been filmed somewhere else at a different time. An actor drove a car on a closed studio stage while the passing landscape was projected on the screen behind him. The result placed in a single frame what had never coexisted in the same physical space. The technique had its limitations. The quality of the projection, the differences in grain between the background layer and the foreground image, lighting that did not always match perfectly. But for decades, it was a practical and efficient solution for building worlds that budget or physics made impossible to film any other way. Ray Harryhausen was O'Brien's direct heir and the animator who took stop motion into its period of greatest inventiveness and public recognition. His creatures populated mythological adventures, science fiction stories, and fantasy films throughout the 1950s and 60s with an energy and charisma that made special effects the main reason many people bought a ticket. Harryhausen developed a process he called dynamation, which refined the compositing of live actors and animated figures so that their interactions felt more believable. The fighting skeletons in Jason and the Argonauts, the Cyclops, the Titans, the sea creatures, all built by hand, moved frame by frame, woven into the image through weeks or months of work that produced just a few minutes of finished footage. Behind every one of those effects were teams of people whose work rarely reached public awareness: background painters, model builders, camera technicians, projection operators, figure sculptors, lighting specialists who spent hours adjusting lamps so that a miniature would read as a full-scale building. Special effects filmmaking in its classical period was an enormously complex craft industry that lived at the margins of credit and visibility. The names on the posters were the directors and the stars. The people who built the impossible worlds worked in workshops separate from the main set, sometimes without the actors or the director knowing exactly how the problem was going to be solved. All of this existed long before computing came anywhere near film production. The tradition of constructing the impossible from physical materials, through manual patience, through optical and mechanical solutions, through paintings and miniatures and articulated figures, was the foundation on which everything that followed was eventually built. When digital cinema arrived and offered new tools for creating worlds, what changed was the process, not the question. The question was still the same one Méliès had asked in his glass studio on the outskirts of Paris. How do you show something that is not really there? Somewhere in a production workshop in the 1930s, a metal and rubber figure in the shape of a giant gorilla waited motionless between takes. The animator adjusted the position of one arm by just a fraction, checked the continuity against the previous frame, and looked through the viewfinder again. In that instant between two photographs, the monster did not exist. On screen, it would exist forever.